Last week, a group of climate protesters interrupted a climate event. Their reasoning? They were there specifically to protest commentator Matt Yglesias and his views on fracking and natural gas. Matt joins the podcast today to talk about what happened. We discuss how the protest went down, why Matt believes fracking is a necessary portion of our energy policy and can even be pro-climate, and why activists often choose flashy, attention-getting, but ineffective methods for their activism. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, leave us a comment, like, subscribe. We appreciate all of that. And if you really enjoyed the podcast, consider becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Members get access to bonus episodes. They get connected with local organizers in their area. They get access to our community Slack, Sticker of the Month Club, and much more. And so if you enjoy the podcast, if you enjoy the work that we do at the Center for New Liberalism, please consider becoming a member. That's cnliberalism.org/become a member. As always, thank you for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Matt Yglesias. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
All right, Matt, so there's a question that I have to start with for what we're talking about today, and I think it's been memed to death on the internet, but that question is, so why do you support fracking?
I love it. I love to.
And yes, I would like to read an article or something.
Yeah. What are we talking about? I think you are referring to a protest event that occurred recently where I was supposed to do a panel discussion with Derek Thompson from The Atlantic. Some guys from Climate Defiance stormed into the room, took the stage, denounced me for my pro-fracking views. And I guess this got on their radar because I had written an article recently saying that I think everybody in Democratic Party politics understands that Vice President Harris saying she supports fracking is electorally helpful in winning the state of Pennsylvania. But I wanted to try to equip people with the information that this is a correct position on the merits and not just an electoral college play there in Pennsylvania. And I think there's frankly a lot of, bad information about this coming from left-wing groups. The main thing that I would say goes missing from this is that natural gas, methane gas, as the left has been trying to rebrand it, continues to be much cleaner than coal, which continues to be very widely used in the modern economy, both for electricity generation and for industrial purposes. And also, natural gas is very highly complementary to renewables. So Gavin Newsom in California, for example, has, probably the cleanest electricity grid of any state out there, but has maintained a number of actually state-operated natural gas plants, which come on when necessary if there is, for weather reasons or whatever else, renewables are not available. So if you look around the world, the kind of very rapid build-out of wind and especially solar that's happened has been done in partnership with natural gas. Keeping natural gas cheap and affordable has been very important to renewables, to bringing emissions down. And then stepping back from the kind of specifics of climate, it's important to understand that the United States of America does not unilaterally decide what kind of energy supplies other countries around the world use. And so, if a country like Germany or Italy or Spain wants to use natural gas, I would rather that they buy gas and oil, for that matter, from the United States of America than from Russia, from Saudi Arabia, from Iran, from Venezuela, things like that. And there's a kind of fantasy world out there which says that if the United States refuses to produce fossil fuels, that other countries around the world will therefore not use any. But that's not how the world works at all. There is a market share competition between, on the one hand, primarily the United States, Norway, Canada, free liberal societies, NATO allies, and an axis of authoritarian states. And I think that it is good to try to transition the world off of fossil fuels. But as long as fossil fuels are used, which they're going to be used, I think, for quite a long time, it's better for those fossil fuels to be made here at home and by our allies.
I would also add there, just to complement that point, that all fossil fuels are not the same, and even all natural gas is not the same. We know for pretty well certain that U.S. natural gas is much, much cleaner than, say, Russian natural gas. We know that Russia basically doesn't give a shit about methane, and that their spillage of methane in their production process is 9 times as high as it is in the U.S. And so, if you to the extent that you can displace Russian natural gas with U.S. natural gas, it is actually much cleaner. So even beyond the geopolitics of it, there's pure climate benefits to replacing Russian natural gas with United States natural gas, simply because our environmental processes are better here.
Well, that's a really important point, because when you get into this, people will say, oh, Matt, you're ignoring the problem of methane leakage, for example. And it's true that is a significant problem. The solution to it, obviously, in general in life, right? This is the New Liberal podcast. I don't think I need to tell people this, but it's good to have free markets. You also need to regulate them, to take care of problems. What you want to regulate is the actual problem, right? In this case, leaks. And we do that in the United States, not perfectly, but a lot better than many other countries do. And so if you want to think about this realistically, you want to fight for rigorous regulation of the domestic industry, but you also don't want to cripple the domestic industry to the point where you're just you're advantaging less regulated foreign competitors. And that's just a kind of a nuance that occurs across the entire environmental space, right? You want to make regulations that actually lead to cleaner outcomes rather than to just pushing activity to the least regulated country.
Now, eventually, we are going to get into the actual conversation about climate activists themselves and the nature of activism and why certain things are effective versus ineffective. But I do want to dive just a little deeper on the fracking question itself, because it is an interesting question. I am someone who kind of naturally agrees with you on this question, and so I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit here, but just to kind of represent the other side, who are skeptical of fracking, who are skeptical of this argument that you're making. I think when you make this kind of pure carbon argument against limiting fracking or banning fracking or whatever the case may be, some people will kind of begrudgingly admit, okay, yes, it's better than coal, for instance, which is what, if we're not going to use natural gas, we're going to have to use more coal. But they will point to other kind of broad environmental concerns about fracking. There's videos of people whose water supply has turned into brown gunk. And I'm not sure about how significant is that. Do you have a sense of the other kind of environmental impacts of fracking and whether we're able to kind of mitigate them effectively?
Yeah, I would say two things on that. One is that it is true that you have had some significant groundwater pollution issues in some places, especially when the industry was brand new. There are tighter rules on that. Practices have generally sort of improved. I would also say, though, that I am actually not a fracking super enthusiast who thinks the federal government needs to come in and preempt local regulation of the industry. Right? This is where the political feedbacks, I think, do come in a relevant way. If the voters of Pennsylvania want to stop fracking because of the localized environmental impacts, I don't think the federal government should stop them. I'm happy to defer to kind of local choice over those localized environmental harms. But what I would then ask progressives is to defer in the opposite direction. I think we know that the Democratic public in Pennsylvania, in Texas, in Alaska wants to foster localized oil and gas industries, and that, we should approach that from a climate perspective in a responsible way, but that it doesn't make sense for us to sweep in and sort of tell Pennsylvania that they need to care more about the potential of localized harms than they do on behalf of us who don't live there, right? That doesn't make sense. Climate change is a global issue. Certain kinds of things, right? Classic acid rain regulation. The issue there was that smokestacks in the Midwest were putting stuff into the air that was blowing east and raining sulfur dioxide down on cities abroad. Local groundwater is like a trade-off that I think people need to think about in terms of the local environmental benefits, other kinds of things they can do, what sort of mitigations they can have, et cetera, et cetera. But we shouldn't fool ourselves, right? When the Biden administration comes in and says they're going to block the Ambler Road mining project in Alaska because of the localized environmental harms associated with mining, to me, that's a little bit fantastical. We're talking about a rare rural state that has actually been trending in the Democrats' direction, where the House member is an elected Democrat, where the Republican, Lisa Murkowski, has been a soldier for moderation. And I would like to, help those people out by saying we're willing to defer to what it is that local people here think is important. And that's where, again, Democrats have broadly decided, we got to win Pennsylvania. Pennsylvanians want fracking. And to me, that's a good enough answer to the local water issues.
I think the local versus global thing is also very interesting because, you mentioned acid rain, which was a pretty localized problem. It originated from one area in the Midwest, and it kind of, the rain would travel in a fairly predictable, pattern based on the weather. And then I contrast that with another thing from the 80s and 90s, which was the ozone layer. And that was a truly globalized problem that required international cooperation. And obviously climate change and oil energy extraction, I'll call it, has both local effects and global effects. But it strikes me that, when we think about these local effects, they get a lot of attention. But what doesn't get a lot of attention is that, climate change is really a globalized problem. We can talk about U.S. policy all we want, but I think U.S. produces something like 13% of all the world's carbon. And so even if we were net zero tomorrow, that doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't even come close. And so, it is certainly still something we should be doing, but it's a much harder problem than that.
Well, I think the old slogan, right, think globally, act locally, has a lot of merit to it. But it requires a greater level of rigor than I think people often have with regard to these things. I mean, and you see this come up all kinds of places. You will see state level emissions targets in the United States that will get adopted in places that are, more progressive than average. That aren't even expressed in any kind of per capita terms, right? So people leaving New York because housing is unaffordable and moving to Florida counts as, helping New York meet its emissions targets. But that doesn't do anything to help the world meet emissions targets. Or you look at different provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Relatively modest amounts of money are being invested in trying to do the research necessary to create low carbon steel. If that pays off, it will have a tremendous impact on worldwide emissions because a good technological solution to that problem would be used in all kinds of different places. Versus there's a lot of money also in that law that aims to accelerate the pace at which Americans switch from, gas and oil furnaces to electric heat pumps. Has a minimal impact on the worldwide emissions picture because it doesn't really alter the trajectory of the technological development. Sometimes people can create, I think, an overly rigid distinction between technology and deployment, and they both matter. But it's important to think, especially when you drill down to countries that are smaller than the United States or to state level action, to think about what are we able to do that influences the global emissions picture? What are the high leverage points versus what is just kind of fiddling around with what's local? And in particular, to avoid things that create the illusion of emissions reduction by pushing the emissions into some other jurisdiction, because that doesn't matter. And it's different from acid rain, right? To an extent, acid rain regulation did just kind of displace industries to other parts of the world. But that can be good for places that are at lower levels of economic development to make different trade-offs around pollution versus economic growth. Climate change is a 100% global issue. So unless your actions actually reduce worldwide emissions, you're not accomplishing anything at all, and need to think, very clearly and very rigorously about that.
So in the spirit of thinking rigorously, I had an interesting question come up when I was discussing this with a friend. And I think this is a really interesting kind of actually think about why do we do certain things a certain way? Why are the incentives set up in a certain way? What this friend remarked to me was, it seems like you guys, the neoliberals broadly, or the wonks, the technocrats, however you want to call the broad grouping that you and I are in, you guys like carbon prices. You like a carbon tax, and that would raise the price of fossil fuels. But you seem to not like it when somebody says, well, we should just stop the supply. And that would also raise the price of fossil fuels and would have kind of a similar effect. You would end up with less coming out of the ground and higher prices. Mm-hmm. So why do you like the carbon tax versus, just restricting the supply? And I'm kind of assuming here that you do enjoy a carbon tax, but I think that's a pretty safe assumption.
Okay, so there's two big differences here. One is the sort of global nature of the market, right? For every barrel of oil that the U.S. government removes from global fossil fuel supply, global oil consumption is reduced by much less than 1 barrel, right? And that's because other countries also produce oil. So to generate the equivalent price, so you could have a carbon tax, say it's $20 per ton. Right? To achieve the same impact on price on the supply side, you have to take tons and tons and tons of domestic fossil fuels off the market, because a very large share of that production is just going to be replaced by foreign production. So it's a much more kind of high cost way of achieving the same reduction in consumption. But then the other difference is that a carbon tax generates tax revenue. Right? If you imposed a carbon tax and then you gathered up all the money that exists from the tax, and then you just handed that money to the king of Saudi Arabia, people would say that's a pretty crazy policy, Matt. Why would you do that with the money? And of course you wouldn't, right? You would use a carbon tax either to shelter the impact, on consumers with some kind of rebate, or you would use it to plug the fiscal hole, right? We have a large budget deficit. Or you would use it to cut some other kind of tax. So, one reason economists are very enthusiastic about taxing pollution isn't that it's good environmental policy, it's that it's a very good tax policy, right? As long as we are going to have tax revenue, it's a good idea to get that revenue from taxing pollution. Supply-side constriction doesn't have any of those benefits, right? Tax revenue is going to go down if you restrict supply. And so in addition to the direct economic hit of the job losses, the indirect economic hit of higher energy costs, you can have a tertiary economic hit in terms of you have to raise other kinds of taxes. And the benefits, right, what would be tax revenue in a carbon pricing situation is instead windfall profits to the producers who aren't getting regulated away. So those are three very different considerations. And if you try to sketch it out as a cost benefit analysis, you could say, well, it might be socially optimal to raise the price of energy by some tiny amount, doing it through supply constriction, but you could get much more leverage. You could clear a much higher cost benefit burden doing it with taxation, because taxation generates revenue, which can offset other kinds of things.
Yeah, I always think of just the kind of the pure efficiency argument when I think of this, and that it's hard for a policymaker to know necessarily what the right level of supply is, right? Should we be having 1 billion tons or 1.2 billion tons of whatever we're talking about? But, with a tax, you can actually allow people to do more of an activity when, and they can respond really rapidly to changing environments, as long as they're willing to pay the tax. Whereas, supply constraint is a very inflexible thing. And, say the economy changes and the supply constraint needs to change. It's a lot easier for a carbon tax system to handle that, I think, rather than, let's go back into Congress and let's, pass a new law that changes the whatever supply constraint we've put into place. That one of those seems a lot more realistic to me.
So I do think, one way we wound up getting on a wrong track here is that, there was an idea going back 15, 20 years ago that was like, okay, we should address climate change with carbon tracks or with cap and trade, some kind of pricing system. And the politics of accomplishing that proved to be very, very, very challenging, which is accurate, right? And I think people need to be prudent, et cetera. So then climate advocates, kind of went back to the drawing board and they said, okay, pricing isn't going to work politically. What can we do? And so they looked sort of very literally at the fact that to pass a carbon price, you need to get majority support in Congress, which is really, really hard, versus the EPA and the Interior Department have just a lot of discretion to kind of screw around. So it's politically easier, they decided, to elect a Democrat and then just have that Democrat say, okay, no new oil and gas leasing. But it turns out that when, the Biden administration tried that, they got sued and they just lost in court. So it's not really politically easier, right? It was just, it's easier, I guess, to break the law than to pass a new law, but it doesn't accomplish anything. Then, the next thing now that they want is, declare a climate emergency, which supposedly would unlock secret special powers to do this. I'm very skeptical that'll work legally, many, many other things like that. But also, the basic fact is that the political problem with carbon pricing is that people get annoyed when their energy costs go up. But there's no magic pathway for supply side policy to reduce emissions that doesn't involve the prices going up. And we all remember when the price of gasoline really spiked after Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022. Gas was getting really expensive. Oil prices were soaring. Absolutely nobody in American politics stood up and said, this is good because this really high price of gasoline is going to put us closer to our emissions targets, right? They didn't say it, right?
Well, it really is. It's incredible the extent to which national politics can be dictated by just how much does it cost to fill up my car. It's a little depressing,
Absolutely.
But it's true.
But when that happened, Republicans blamed Joe Biden, Biden blamed Putin, and left-wing people blamed price gouging by nefarious oil companies. And, we can argue what was the exact apportionment of blame. I tend to think that it really was Russia was responsible primarily for it. But either way, the point is absolutely nobody took the position, oh, this expensive gasoline is good, right? So if the climate emergency strategy worked, right, if it successfully shut down enough domestic production that foreign competitors couldn't just plug the gap and prices really did rise, so consumption went down and emissions went down, you'd be left holding the bag. You know what I mean? Like if you had to stand up there and tell voters, yes, it is true, my climate emergency proclamation is responsible for the soaring price of gasoline, you'd be in terrible shape, right? It is as hard as it might be to directly raise the price of energy through pricing. It is much, much, much harder to do it in a way that gives you no revenue, right? That you don't get to say, look, guys, I know this sucks, but we also saved Social Security, or I know this is painful, but I was able to offset with a big tax cut. To just say, look, in exchange for this more expensive oil, you get nothing, but Iran gets extra oil revenue. Like that's nowhere, right? That's refusing to think around the corner in your political strategy. If you're like, oh, taxing is too heavy a lift, here's this other idea. Like it's not any easier. It's not any better. And we know it. We saw how Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, AOC responded to spiking oil prices. None of them were like, fuck yeah, this is incredible. So like they know on some level that like it's not actually viable. And I don't think that they're thinking clearly about their own preferences around this.
It would have been very funny, by the way, if at least one member in a very, very deep blue district just decided to take the plunge and say, you know what, this is great. But as you pointed out, that did not happen. And I think this transitions us into kind of a conversation about political strategy and about climate activism more broadly. Because, you know, half the conversation we're having is just the kind of the technical case for why you believe what you do about fracking. And I think there's a pretty strong case there. Maybe some other people can nitpick some points. But the other thing that we're talking about, the reason we're talking about this is because of this event that you were at that very publicly got disrupted and it kind of went viral across politics, Twitter, and now your face is on like meme templates. And so I guess just to kick off, before we get into the depths of like what is good climate strategy and what is not, can you tell us a little bit about that day, just from a first person view? Can you give us the play-by-play of like, you're at the conference, you're on stage, you're doing your thing. Tell us how this happened.
Well, so it's very funny. So the theme of the conference, it was a conference about abundance, right? And a kind of effort to bring people together from across energy, housing, a couple other policy areas.
And a shout out, by the way, to the Breakthrough Institute, who does great work, I think.
Yes. I think, you know, similar in spirit to some of what you guys are doing with the New Liberal Project, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of different initiatives underway these days to try to kind of rebuild the rational center of American politics, specifically with regard to economic policy in this era of surging populism. Right before there was like lunch was served, and they had a lightning talk from Ted Nordhaus, who is the longtime founder, director of the Breakthrough Institute. And Ted just like spoke briefly on the topic of abundance to say that, you know, people should never think that the environmentalist movement will embrace abundance, that like they are the enemy, and we should all be realistic about that. You know, it was very bracing. Then Derek Thompson and I went up. I was, you know, going to ask him about the book project he's working on with Ezra Klein. One of the lines of inquiry I wanted to push on is that Derek and Ezra are like two of the nicest, most kind of like generously spirited people who I know. But I kind of agree with Ted that abundance is going to require more elbow throwing than those guys kind of like. And then, just as if to perfectly illustrate the point, these climate defiance guys storm the stage and they start yelling. Climate defiance, you know, is a group that's been operating for a while. They are funded by the Climate Emergency Fund, which one of the Getty oil heiresses is responsible for. Adam McKay also gives them a lot of money. This is related to the Just Stop Oil group in the UK, except the UK versions of this, they like to throw soup at priceless works of art. The American ones like to attack center-left people who are trying to do something constructive. So, like, I've never seen climate defiance protest a Republican. I've seen them interrupt a Joe Manchin talk at Harvard. I've seen them yell at Ali Zaidi from the Biden climate team many times. They yelled at me and Derek Thompson. This is kind of their stock in trade. They want to kind of, I would say, like, wrest control of the brand so that if you want to represent yourself as caring at all about climate, you need to embrace their kind of very, very extreme views. It's a very polarizing strategy. It indulges certain people's love of direct action as a thing. It seems to me like Joe Manchin, by A, representing West Virginia in the Senate, a very conservative state, and by B, putting together the Inflation Reduction Act's energy provisions, has done more to address climate change than possibly anyone else in the history of global politics. But he's a big enemy for them because he doesn't want to ban all fossil fuels. I don't really know, why they think I am. I mean, they were yelling at me technically for agreeing with the Biden-Harris administration's position on this. So, I do agree with them, but, this has got nothing to do with me, and I don't really know why they found this opportune. But they got a lot of attention on Twitter. I got a lot of attention on Twitter. It got attention to the Abundance Conference, which I think the organizers appreciate. So I guess that's kind of win-win for everyone involved.
This is something I think about a lot in terms of just I'm someone who, because of who I am, because of the group that I founded, I think a lot about ineffective lefty organizing and how it drives me crazy that even in areas where I agree with the ultimate goal that they're going for, I think we both want a decarbonized world, that what they're doing is actually counterproductive to the mission. And I'm curious your thoughts in terms of, do you think that or I guess I'll ask it this way. How do you think they model the problem? If we're trying to inhabit the climate defiance or the Just Stop Oil people or the people who, sit in a roadway and block a freeway and infuriate half of a city in the name of the climate, they glue themselves to a basketball court. They throw oil on a famous painting, or they throw soup on a famous painting or whatever. In their minds, what is the actual, what is the pathway to success here? Because to me, it almost there's a common joke, the underpants gnomes from South Park, where the underpants gnomes are first we collect the underpants, and then step 2 is a series of question marks, and then step 3 is profit. And to me, there's the giant question marks are in there, how is this actually going to do anything? But I wonder, do they have a clear story? Do you think you can put yourself in their shoes of what is the story that they think this is going to be a really good thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a few different things, or maybe just two, going on here. One is there's a kind of a left activist tactical playbook that is just kind of used across the board on almost every topic. Right. And the centerpiece of this playbook is that you always want to be building activist power. And the way that you build activist power is that you pick high profile fights. You need to pick those fights with people who plausibly care what you say about them. Right. Which means the fights have to be with Democrats rather than with Republicans. And you have to be asking Democrats to do something for you that is in their power to do, right? So you can't protest Republicans, and the Democrats' answer to you can't ever be, help me beat Republicans at elections, and then I can do more progressive politics. So that's how you end up with fixation on something like student loan forgiveness, right? Because once upon a time, Joe Biden had a kind of big plan to make community college more available to people, to reform the higher ed sector, but that would require legislation. For him to get that legislation, he would need more votes in Congress. For him to get more votes in Congress, you have to help moderate Democrats beat conservative Republicans. And that's just anathema to leftists. So they say, like, we need to be protesting Biden. What can we demand that Biden do? Well, what we can demand he do is student loan forgiveness. So you get this kind of hyperfixation on things that aren't really important because it serves the activism agenda. And the theory of change is that by building activist power over the long term, you kind of move policy to the left. So that applies to an extent to this fossil fuel leasing. But I also think that there is actually a difference in goals, right? I mean, you said that you share the same goal as the climate defiance protesters. And I don't think, I don't want to tell you what goals you have, but I don't think that I do share the same goal, right? Like, I want a prosperous world with abundant energy. I think that we need to take the science of pollution and climate change seriously as we make energy policy, right? Like, we need a policy framework that pushes toward the use of cleaner sources rather than dirty ones, that tries to internalize the externalities associated with burning dirty fuels, et cetera. But like, I don't support decarbonization at all costs, right? If you give me two pathways to the future, and on one of them, sub-Saharan Africa gets on the same growth trajectory that India has been on, and India gets on the growth trajectory that China's been on, or you give me another pathway where South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa remain poor forever, I think the growth pathway is better, even though it will almost certainly mean more pollution than the stagnation pathway. So, I want to do things that promote clean energy distinctively in poor countries, but I don't want to cut them off from access to the fossil fuels that rich countries use to develop. I want to reduce global dependence on oil, but I don't want to, quote unquote, just stop oil, right? Like, if we stopped oil tomorrow, there would be no air travel. There would be no maritime shipping. It would be a cataclysm, right? Versus encourage people to switch to electric cars. That sounds great. Invest in research and development for sustainable aviation fuels. Yes, maybe in the future we can have tiny nuclear reactors powering big container ships, and that would be amazing. I don't know what we need to do to figure out how to solve for these kinds of problems, but I think we need to try to figure it out in a way that is compatible with global prosperity. And I think they don't think that, that's why they characterize my view as climate denialism, because they are actually in the grips of an unscientific, catastrophist interpretation of climate change, such that any price would be worth paying for emissions reduction. And that's just not right. That's not what the IPCC reports say. It's rattled around in people's brains. McKay, who's one of the people behind them, he made this movie, Don't Look Up, and it's a climate change allegory. But in his allegorical scenario, a comet is going to hit the Earth and literally wipe out all life. If that were happening, it would be worth taking much more dramatic action than the action that is actually worth taking to avert 2 degrees Celsius of warming.
Yeah, I probably give them more credit than is strictly necessary. And this gets into a lot of topics like degrowth. And, there are some people who are very explicit degrowthers on the left, and they're not as common, but there are a lot of more, we could call them implicit degrowthers who don't explicitly say, yes, the world should get poorer or the world should stop growing, but they do very much advocate for policies that are, if not outright contemptuous of growth, that would certainly slow it down and would cause a lot of poverty in the world. And so maybe I'm giving the climate defiance people more credit than they deserve in terms of what they actually want. But most people want, like you said, a world where eventually we are using less carbon, and maybe we disagree on the pathway to get there, right? Between the practicals and the kind of more ideologically strident anti-fossil fuel people. And I think the point about doom is really interesting because it's something I've written about before. I've said that like we live in an age of doom where every problem is catastrophized and every problem is worse than it's ever been. This actually extends beyond climate. If you ask people, how are race relations right now? They'll give you an answer race relations are worse than they were in the 70s. Like public sentiment about race relations is worse than it was 40 and 50 years ago when very clearly, like in an objective sense, things were worse for racial minorities. And if you ask this about the state of the economy, the whole Will Stancil argument that people think the economy is terrible when it's one of the stronger economies we've had in a generation. You can ask about the climate, where I'm going to get the exact number wrong, but something like 40 or 50% of young people think they personally will die because of climate change. And you can argue whether they're answering this literally or they're answering the poll just giving the pro-climate answer based on vibes. But we live in this age, probably due to social media and a lot of these kind of media societal factors, where things just, it really feels for a lot of young people like doom is everywhere and everything is awful all the time. And I think that feeds into this a lot, this type of activism.
I think that people have gotten worse at reconciling their stated opinions about things with the actual actions that they take, right? So over the course of my adult life, the discourse has become increasingly populated with kind of doomy prognostications about climate change. At the same time, I've seen no inclination among people to start moving to Iowa or Wisconsin. The United States of America is blessed or cursed, but blessed, I think, with large amounts of territory that are quite cold and have very abundant freshwater resources. And people are demonstrably not moving to them, right? They're moving to Arizona, which is incredibly hot. They're moving to Florida, which is less hot, but more prone to hurricanes and coastal flooding. And like maybe that will turn around at some point. But it hasn't been turning around. I think that when people use their kind of near brain, they sort of put this in perspective. Obviously, people in Florida wish that there were fewer hurricanes rather than more. But all things considered, they prefer the weather in Florida to the weather in Milwaukee or in Cleveland. That's why they live there. Like that, the entire foundation of that state is that the combination of hot weather, plentiful coastline, et cetera, is on balance good. Then you see some of the stuff in the opposite direction, where like the situation, unfolding in Gaza is genuinely horrifying and really, really bad. So that has started to fill up more and more and more of people's time and attention and concern. People who like aren't normally interested in international issues like to think about sort of like terrible things happening far away. They say that terrible things are happening in their communities that are not consistent with the actions that they're taking. And you gave this race relations example, and it's like I see those polls, and I'm always just like, it's like, do you actually think that? Have you like run that idea by anybody who's elderly? Like, did you ever read a book? Like, what do you think happened in the world? And so I think a lot of this behavior is sort of, loosely expressive. A lot of it is mediated by the fact that alarmist content performs better in a competitive media environment. And I'm not really sure what to do about it, because I'm somebody who believes in technology, believes in markets, believes in progress. And so it's discomforting to me to reach the conclusion that these improvements in information technology have led to, I think, like a bad outcome in which people are constantly bombarded with kind of negativity about everything all the time. And, that's not healthy for us as a society or as a polity.
Now, one of the things that I talk about a lot, like I said, is my frustration with kind of lefty activism. And that's, again, it's part of who I am. I don't claim to be unbiased because I'm definitely biased. I have an ideological point of view. But when you said the word expressive there, that maybe they're just answering these polls in an expressive way because it doesn't match their actions, I think that's part of what's going on here too. That, we can tell a story about like there's, leaders of an activist movement who have this theory of activist power, and so that's why they do things in a certain way. But I think for a lot of kind of the rank and file people in these organizations, the actual kids who they recruit to go throw soup on something or to hot glue themselves to an NBA court at, during halftime, I think for those people, a lot of this really is kind of like activism as a form of self-expression in that, to me, activism is about making change happen in the real world. If you've read the Eitan Hersh book, Politics is for Power, the politics is something that you have to seize power and change things with it. And I think for a lot of people, that's just not true. For a lot of people, activism is a kind of social club. Or activism is a means of personal self-expression. It's a way to show that you really, really care. And I've done this thing that's really loud, and it got me a lot of attention as a side effect, and it shows everybody how much I care. And I kind of despair of trying to figure out how do we get people to care more about like what are the actual outcomes of my actions? What change will this actually have in the world? Because I think in a lot of instances that there's just no thought as to, that's not even something that comes up in the discussion necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, in the specific case of climate, I mean, I would even go sort of beyond that, right? Which is, one question is like, can we just conduct our politics in a less expressive way? The other thing that I would challenge people who are interested in climate in particular is like, why are you so focused on politics, right? Like if you want to know politically how to make an impact on climate change, I think like the really, really, really boring answer is that you should give money to moderate Democrats to help them beat conservative Republicans in swing races, right? And like you should write them a little note and say like, sir, I'm interested in clean energy and I want you to like run to win, and then just like move on with your life.
This is funny. This is funny just because I was going to transition us after this into talking about like, if you and I were going to be more constructive than them, what's our actual like give well style recommendations for like, what should climate activists or people with money, what should they actually be doing, right?
Well, but I mean, I was going to say the next step of this is like, and I concede like that would be very emotionally unsatisfying, right? To just like send some money to Jared Golden and move on. You say, well, I want to dedicate my life to this, right? But it's like, Fervo Energy is a company that is trying to develop advanced geothermal power that could unlock potentially large amounts of 24/7 sustainable energy. And they have just like open positions. You could go work for them as a field operations engineer or an accounts payable clerk or as corporate counsel or as an accountant, right? Like clean energy is real at this point in time, right? Like there are real companies that are trying to manufacture and sell heat pumps and induction stoves. Those companies need like salesmen, they need electricians, they need smart engineers, they need people to like design all the things that a company needs, right? Utility scale solar, that is a real thing. There are lots of startups working on advanced nuclear, working on fusion. There are people trying to build offshore wind farms. Like if you want to dedicate your life to the fight for climate change, like it depends on exactly what your skills and interests are, but I think you should like actually go do it. Like don't dedicate your life to activism. find one of the companies who are deploying clean energy or trying to make clean steel or clean cement and like go work for them, like do the work and do the thing, which is not to say that politics isn't important, but I don't think that politics actually needs your full-time attention unless what you want to do is like super pragmatic politics, which I completely respect that like lots of people, most people, I think, do not have the temperament to do pragmatic politics. They want to express their passion for what they care most about. But the best way to do that is like outside of the political domain. If you are a company that like makes solar electricity for the world, you don't need to like spend a lot of time pretending to have moderate opinions or appreciate the contributions of coal miners. You can throw yourself 24/7 into renewable energy. It's just like you have to go do that. You have to like stop doing politics and stop thinking of this as primarily a problem of political symbolism rather than dozens and dozens of logistical, technological, economic, business model, et cetera, problems that just need people to work on them.
And this is the kind of somewhat correct view, I think, that ultimately, if we're going to solve this problem, we're not going to do it politically, we're going to do it technologically. That is, in the decades-long kind of formulation of this, we can invent our way out of climate change, but it's going to be nearly impossible to just politics our way out of climate change.
Yeah, I mean, and I would say to just politics, right? I mean, we make policy. We have made a number of policy changes going back to Affordable Care Act, the 2020 Energy Bill, IRA. There's a permitting bill that's important. I mean, policy change is important, but there's a ping pong of it, right? It's like first you do all this legislation to create a viable electric car industry, but then like somebody's got to buy the cars. Somebody has to build the charging stations. Somebody has to like do the marketing for the car companies to make people excited about it. You're not going to someday like pass a law that's like, and now climate change is fixed, right? There's always going to be a back and forth between addressing policy problems and addressing technology, economic, business model, et cetera problems. And I think that if the thing you want emotionally is to dedicate your whole life to climate, you are better off working on the practical side than on the policy side. If you're determined to work on politics and policy, that's great, but you kind of need to check your expressive emotional side at the door and look at a much more cold-eyed way at what the political landscape looks like.
If I was to offer kind of my own formulation for this, my own idea of like what is the most effective thing you can do if you are really genuinely want to dedicate your life to climate and to solving climate change. When I thought about this, I had two ideas. And one of them was what you're saying, was actually just like, technology somehow, whether you want to go work for these companies or you want to give money to like a promising startup or something of that nature. Just number one is the technology space generally. Number two, and I'm curious what you think about this, is get out of a United States focus and, give money to a think tank or found a think tank that figures out how do we get the governments of China and India to care more about climate change, because it is a global problem, and that is where the majority of carbon is being emitted now. Every rich country, as far as I'm aware, every rich country is already on a downward slope as far as their carbon emissions. We've already decoupled. And so, yeah, we can go faster. Maybe that's good, but that is somewhat of a solved problem. China and India's carbon emissions are not. And, if there's a think tank that would have even a small chance at reducing China's emissions by 1%, like that's a really big number. That would be a massive impact for one think tank to have, probably bigger than anything they could do in the United States. And so I don't actually know who the right group is here. I don't know if there are groups doing this, but that would be my answer, is like, try to figure out, get somebody smart, either you do it or give money to somebody who can do it, to figure out how do we get the leadership of the CCP or Modi or the Indian public or whatever to care more about reducing carbon emissions? Come up with a strategy for that, because that would be really, really impactful.
Yeah, I mean, the China part of this is very difficult because I think it's just like really not obvious what what will influence their calculations. Obviously, if Americans had good ideas about how to effectively manipulate the Chinese political system, we would be doing a lot of things differently over there. This is in some ways like the central problem of the world right now, and I don't have a lot to offer on it. But I do think the other piece of this, right, is energy and growth in in India, Africa, and Latin America, right? And there's one group that I know of that's called the Energy for Growth Hub, which is very focused on these kind of issues. And there, I think it's not a question of like, how do we get the government of Nigeria to quote unquote care about climate change? It's like, how do we get countries that are so incredibly poor right now, how are they able to industrialize in a cleaner way, right? And that's in part a political problem in those countries, and in part a technological problem that has an interplay in the U.S. and around the world. Kimberly Klausing is a professor at UCLA, worked in the Biden administration. She was telling me that she's been pitching developing countries on carbon tax recently. And that part of her argument in that context is that it's actually much more administratively tractable than a lot of the tax systems that low-income countries are trying to use. So you could raise more revenue at lower rates with less distortion, et cetera, on the countries. That was a really interesting idea to me. The global emissions impact of carbon pricing in poor countries is going to be low because those countries are so poor. But because it's better tax policy, it actually might let them grow more and grow in a clean way, and then build a global constituency for pricing in a way that would be efficacious. I do think, working on geothermal applications could be very powerful in East Africa, where it seems like they have a lot of, the geology that would be beneficial for it. If you could have cheap, clean energy in Kenya and Uganda, things like that, that would be a huge change for the world. If you could influence Indian politics constructively, I mean, I don't know how you do that. But to look back to where we started, one thing that a lot of countries are going to be concerned about is energy security, right? Coal is abundant in a lot of places in the world. And even though it's incredibly polluting, I think the government of India in particular is going to be inclined to say, look, we have coal, we can burn coal, and then we can have electricity that we control. And the United States needs to think about our role in the worldwide energy supply. I think that one reason we want to produce and export natural gas in the United States is that we want to make fellow democracies around the world feel like they can rely on us for gas rather than generating coal at home, which is much, much, much more polluting. And then that's also why, we need technology, we need, advanced nuclear reactors, all that other kind of stuff, because these are just challenging problems, particularly for poor countries that need to balance so many different considerations.
I'm glad that we could, kind of have this part of the conversation, though, because I feel like it's good for us to practice what we preach in terms of, if we're criticizing someone else for doing ineffective, expressive acts of activism, then we should at least be willing to step up and say, what do we think is better? Because it's not necessarily just having a podcast conversation. That is not the answer, as much as I enjoy it.
Yeah.
We are coming up on time, though. So I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask on this show. And that is, where can people go to learn more if they're interested either in the conversations about the fracking and the technical question of, is fracking good? Does it actually displace CO2? Or if they're interested in kind of ideas about activism and how to be effective and why activists perform the way they do. I'm curious what you would direct people to. And I will start by saying that Matt has a great article on the merits of fracking. It's at slowboring.com, which of course you should subscribe to. I think the article is titled "Harris is Right on the Merits About Fracking." So you can look at, we'll link that in the show notes. I would also encourage people to read my own work on, Activism is not a social club, which I've written at Infinite Scroll. But now that we're done with the self-promotion, Matt, other than yourself, is there other sources you would link people to that are useful for understanding what we're talking about, either on fracking or on kind of the activism complex that we're talking about?
Well, I would just say I really recommend the work that the Breakthrough Institute does on climate. I recommend Third Way's climate and energy program. I think there's a lot of people, I don't say a lot, there are plenty of people in Washington and around the country who are trying to do, what I would consider science-informed energy policy rather than kind of climate fanaticism. But those people could use more exposure. I think of those two institutions as really kind of leading the way and have a lot of good information on kind of specific issues and technical questions. I also just encourage everybody, like the next time you see an account of activists doing something, just like stop and think critically for yourself. Like why is this? Like, what's going on? I think a presumption developed at some point over the course of my lifetime that because the civil rights movement was successful, that anything that's important should model itself on the civil rights movement. But there were actually like very peculiar features of that situation that inspired the set of tactics that are associated with it. And like almost nothing is really comparable to that and needs to kind of, just be rethought from the ground up.
I will close with one thought, comparing this to kind of a different technical problem, because you're right. A lot of things are compared to the civil rights movement. And I actually like to point to something else when I think about climate change. And it's that I feel like we actually have a pretty good record as an advanced society, an advanced global society in solving problems like this. And it's not a one-to-one comparison, but, acid rain was a big problem, but we solved it. It's done now. Like we fixed it. And the ozone layer was a big problem, but we actually all came together as a global community and the ozone layer is healing now. The hole in the ozone layer is mostly closed up at this point, and we did it. And I actually think that just, to counter all the doom, society is pretty good at solving problems when we really get down to it. And maybe we're too slow. Maybe, we're not doing it fast enough. I can certainly sympathize with that. And climate change is a really hard problem. But to everybody listening out there, like, society's good at fixing things. Humans are endlessly creative and capable, and there's no reason to kind of succumb to doom. I think we can do it. I'm optimistic about our future, even though I think climate change will be really bad.
I think Kelsey Piper wrote a great ozone hole article in January 2023 for Vox that I really recommend, that goes into it in some detail. The acid rain thing, my mind was blown. A few years ago, I was talking to a young woman, a journalist, professional, quite good, but quite a bit younger than me. And she was, despairing about climate. And, I told her about acid rain, and she had never heard of this as a question, because when problems get solved, we don't think about them that much anymore.
This is very common. I found this too. I found that when I talk to young Zoomers, 22-year-olds, 24-year-olds, they literally have never heard of acid rain.
So when I was a kid, I grew up in Manhattan, and we have a lot of big old stone buildings there, and we have a certain number of public statues, and they were all streaked, visibly marred. And I would ask, what's up with that? Why is this statue so fucked up? And it was because of the acid rain. Acid fell from the sky. And, I think the big problems is it was killing all kinds of birds' eggs and amphibian life. And, it's bad to drink water that has sulfuric acid in it. But it had this incredibly potent visual impact on the landscape that's completely gone now because, we addressed it. And if you read about the campaign against acid rain in detail. I mean, Google it, look it up. You'll see it's different from climate change in a lot of ways. You can't like just mechanically apply the same solutions, but also like it was solvable. It took time and it took, some effort, and there were trade-offs involved, and the politics wasn't always as easy as you would like it to be. And some of the stuff that people these days blame on trade maybe had to do with like making it harder for the Midwest to dump acid into the air of the northeastern megalopolis. But it's good to learn about how problems are solved, and to try to learn in some detail, because the answer is never, and it always did involve like some people who were just kind of shouting like, hey, pay attention to this. But there's so much more to a solution than just like somebody yelling about how like this is bad. Because like, yes, it is bad, but then the question is like, how do you address it? Like, what would be better?
As you said, the politics is not always as easy as we'd like it to be, but we know that politics is a strong and slow boring of hard boards. I think I got that quote right. So we will continue to do the work of drilling through those boards. I want to thank one more time my guest for this episode for coming on the show, Matt Yglesias. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.